In the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean, far beyond supply lines and radar screens, a Japanese submarine slipped silently through enemy waters, carrying something no one expected. Not torpedoes, not commandos, but aircraft. Two miniature bombers, folded like insects in a steel hangar, crossing thousands of miles beneath the sea. Their mission wasn't to win a battle. It was to send a message that nowhere on Earth was truly safe. And for a brief moment in World War II, that message reached the American mainland. The Pacific War began not as a clash of borders, but as a war without edges. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the battlefield expanded into nearly 64 million square miles of open ocean, an expanse so vast it dwarfed armies, air forces, and even imagination. Distance itself became a weapon. Every operation demanded fuel, steel, trained crews, and time measured not in hours, but in weeks of uninterrupted sailing. Victory would belong not only to those who fought well, but to those who could reach the fight at all. By early 1942, Imperial Japan stood at the height of its tactical success. Its navy had struck first, hard and with devastating precision. American battleships lay burning in Hawaiian waters. British power in Southeast Asia collapsed with alarming speed. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, Japanese forces advanced with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. Yet beneath this surge lay an unspoken truth. Japan was winning battles faster than it could win the war. Japan's industrial base was limited. Its oil lifelines were fragile, and its greatest enemy, the United States, possessed an economy that could outbuild, outfuel, and eventually outlast it. Japanese naval planners understood this reality with cold clarity. Time was the enemy. The solution, they believed, was not endurance, but shock, decisive, psychological blows delivered so suddenly and so far from home that the enemy would lose the will to continue. This belief was rooted in Japan's naval doctrine. Since the early 20th century, the Imperial Japanese Navy had emphasized reach, surprise, and the annihilation of enemy morale. Battleships and carrier aviation were tools of decision, but submarines offered something different: invisibility. Traditionally, submarines were hunters, ambushers meant to stalk warships and strangle supply lines. But in 1942, a radical idea began circulating within the Navy's strategic circles. What if submarines could do more than hunt? What if they could strike from the air? The concept was audacious. Submarines acting as aircraft carriers, crossing entire oceans undetected, surfacing near enemy shores, assembling aircraft on open decks, and launching airstrikes where no enemy expected them. Engineers worried about stability, range, and detection. Senior officers questioned whether such vessels were practical or merely prestige projects in a navy already stretched thin. Every risk was obvious. Every failure would be catastrophic. But the promise was irresistible. A weapon that could bypass fleets, radar, and defenses. A way to bring the war directly to the enemy's doorstep. Somewhere in a quiet shipyard, steel plates were riveted together around that idea. And as one massive hull slipped beneath the waves, it carried with it a gamble born of desperation, a vision that challenged the limits of naval warfare itself. By 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy was building a weapon that challenged every assumption of undersea warfare. At the center of this ambition stood the Type B-1 long-range submarines, vessels so large, complex, and unconventional that many officers quietly questioned whether they should exist at all. Among them was I-25, a submarine designed not merely to stalk ships, but to project air power across oceans. These boats were enormous by submarine standards of the era, stretching more than 350 feet in length and displacing over 2,500 tons when submerged. They were closer in size to surface combatants than traditional submarines. Their greatest strength was range. With fuel capacity unmatched by most navies, they could steam more than 37,000 miles at cruising speed, enough to circle the globe without refueling. In a war defined by distance, that capability made them uniquely dangerous. Yet it was not size or endurance that made the Type B-1 submarines revolutionary. It was the cylindrical, watertight hangar mounted forward of the conning tower, an armored tube designed to carry an aircraft. This single feature transformed the submarine's role. No longer limited to periscope depth and torpedoes, it could now scout enemy harbors, track fleet movements, and in extraordinary circumstances, strike targets ashore. The aircraft itself was the Yokosuka E14Y, known to Allied intelligence as Glen. It was a fragile machine, lightweight, fabric-skinned, and powered by a modest engine. It carried a two-man crew, a pilot and an observer, sometimes doubling as a navigator and bombardier. Its bomb load was limited, but its value lay in reconnaissance and reach rather than destruction. Stored disassembled in the submarine's hangar, the Glen could be brought onto the deck, assembled, fueled, and launched by catapult in under 30 minutes, if everything went perfectly. That if defined the entire concept. Every stage of the operation was exposed to failure. Rough seas could delay assembly. A single mechanical fault could trap the aircraft on deck while enemy patrols closed in. Launching required the submarine to surface fully, making it vulnerable to aircraft, ships, and coastal observers. Recovery was even more dangerous, demanding calm water and precise timing as the float plane landed beside the submarine to be hoisted aboard. The human cost of this innovation was carried by the crew. Submariners trained not only as sailors, but as aircraft handlers, mechanics, and deck crews. Young naval aviators volunteered to fly missions with no precedent and little margin for survival. There were no manuals for such operations, only drills, experimentation, and faith in engineering. This was innovation colliding with fragility, a weapon of astonishing reach balanced on the edge of catastrophe. And somewhere on the open sea, steel doors unlocked and swung outward. Salt water rushed past the deck. Crated wings were lifted into place, and impossibly an airplane began to take shape atop a submarine, alone between ocean and sky. The journey began in silence, not with fanfare, but with a slow descent beneath the Pacific. From Japanese-controlled waters, the submarine set its course eastward into an ocean that offered no cover, only distance. The transit alone would test the limits of both machine and men. From departure to destination, the voyage would span thousands of miles, more than 8,000 nautical miles round trip, carried out far beyond the reach of reliable resupply or friendly air cover. To survive, the submarine avoided known Allied patrol lanes, steering clear of shipping routes, island chains, and air-sea search grids established after Pearl Harbor. This meant long detours and careful navigation using dead reckoning, celestial fixes, and periscope observations taken only when necessary. Radio silence was rigidly enforced. Messages were kept brief, transmitted only at prearranged times, and often delayed for days to reduce the risk of interception. Each transmission was a calculated gamble. Inside the pressure hull, time lost meaning. The air grew stale, thick with diesel fumes and humidity. Condensation dripped from pipes and bulkheads. Food was rationed carefully, fresh supplies consumed early, followed by preserved rations as the days stretched into weeks. Sleep came in shifts, often interrupted by engine noise, depth changes, or mechanical alarms. Every system, engines, batteries, compressors, was under constant strain, and every repair had to be performed with tools and parts already on board. The contrast between worlds was stark. Above the hull lay an ocean so vast it seemed empty, its surface rolling endlessly beneath open sky. Below, men lived shoulder to shoulder in steel compartments, navigating by dim lights and habit. There was no room for error. A single miscalculation could leave the submarine stranded, detected, or unable to surface. For the aircrew, the pressure was different but no less intense. The pilots knew their role would begin only after the most dangerous part of the journey was complete. They studied maps of unfamiliar coastlines and memorized landmarks they had never seen. Navigation would rely on compass headings, stopwatch timing, and visual references. There would be no fighter escort, no radio guidance, and no rescue if they went down. Once launched, they would be alone. As the submarine closed on the eastern Pacific, vigilance increased. Lookouts rotated more frequently. Periscope sweeps were shorter, faster. The risk of patrol aircraft and coastal observers grew with every mile. American defenses were tightening, but vast stretches of coastline remained untested, unprepared for an enemy approach from beneath the sea. Then at last the submarine slowed and rose toward periscope depth. The lens broke the surface, water streaming away as the image sharpened. Where there should have been only the horizon, land appeared dark, solid, and impossibly close. An enemy shore, untouched by war, now lay within reach. Just before dawn in September 1942, the submarine surfaced in heavy seas off the American west coast. Swells rolled across the deck, forcing the crew to work against both time and water. Lookouts scanned the horizon while engineers released the locks on the forward hangar. Steel doors swung open at sea level, and cold ocean air rushed inside. Every minute on the surface increased the risk of discovery. The aircraft was brought out in sections and assembled by hand on the pitching deck. Wings were bolted into place, control cables checked, fuel lines connected. There was no margin for error. The Yokosuka E14Y float plane, light, exposed, and unforgiving, was the only weapon this submarine carried that could reach the American mainland. Its pilot, Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita, and observer Petty Officer Shoji Okuda climbed aboard knowing there would be no fighter cover, no radio guidance, and no rescue if they failed to return. As coastal fog drifted in, the submarine turned into the wind. The catapult fired. The float plane surged forward and lifted into the gray sky, vanishing almost immediately into cloud. Below, the submarine submerged once more, leaving the aircrew alone over enemy territory. Flying inland, Fujita navigated by compass, stopwatch, and brief breaks in the fog. Beneath the aircraft stretched dense forests, vast, dry, and largely undefended. There were no interceptors, no anti-aircraft fire, no alarms. The silence was unsettling. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, a Japanese aircraft was flying unchallenged over the continental United States. The mission's objective was not precision bombing, but psychological impact. The Glen carried incendiary bombs designed to ignite large-scale forest fires, forcing the diversion of manpower and spreading fear far from the front lines. Near the forests of southern Oregon, close to the town of Brookings, Fujita released his payload. The bombs fell into the trees below, igniting small fires that briefly smoldered before being contained by damp conditions and local response. The physical damage was limited. No civilians were killed, no towns were destroyed. Yet the significance lay elsewhere. This was the first and only time during the war that enemy bombs fell on the American mainland from the air. Fuel was already running low as the aircraft turned back toward the sea. Every minute mattered. American patrols had begun searching after reports of explosions inland. Fujita descended through clouds, scanning for the dark shape of the submarine amid the waves. At last it appeared, small, exposed, and vulnerable on the open ocean. The float plane landed hard beside it and was hauled aboard as quickly as possible. Within minutes, the hangar doors were sealed and the submarine slipped beneath the surface, disappearing once again into the Pacific. The aircraft was gone, the damage was minimal, but the message had been delivered. The war had crossed an ocean, breached a continent, and left its mark. America now knew its shores were no longer beyond reach. The American response was swift, controlled, and deliberately quiet. Within hours of reports from southern Oregon, the U.S. military increased coastal patrols along the west coast. Army Air Force's aircraft expanded reconnaissance flights. Naval units tightened anti-submarine screens offshore. Radar stations and civilian observers were instructed to report anything unusual. Yet the public heard almost nothing. Authorities chose restraint over alarm, suppressing details of the attack to deny Japan the very panic it had hoped to provoke. From a strategic standpoint, the bombing failed to achieve its purpose. The incendiary devices dropped over the Oregon forests were designed to ignite large-scale fires, forcing the diversion of firefighting resources and spreading fear far from the front lines. Instead, nature intervened. Recent rainfall and high humidity prevented the flames from spreading. The fires were small, isolated, and quickly contained. No towns were threatened. No civilian casualties occurred. The American home front remained calm, largely unaware that it had been targeted at all. The limitations of the attack were structural as well as environmental. The Yokosuka E14Y floatplane carried only a minimal bomb load. There was no possibility of sustained operations, no follow-up strikes, and no supporting force. Each mission required an enormous investment of time, fuel, and risk for a single aircraft and a single submarine. Against a continental nation with vast resources, the effort was disproportionate to the result. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, the mission was assessed with mixed emotions. Technically, it succeeded. A submarine had crossed the Pacific undetected, launched an aircraft near enemy shores, struck the American mainland, and returned safely. From an engineering and operational standpoint, it proved the concept worked, but militarily the impact was negligible. No resources were diverted from American offensives. No morale shock materialized. The war continued unchanged. As 1942 turned into 1943, Japan's strategic situation worsened. Carrier losses at Midway, mounting defeats across the Pacific, and relentless American industrial output forced difficult choices. Resources were increasingly diverted toward defense, protecting sea lanes, fortifying islands, and replacing losses rather than pursuing bold but marginal innovations. Submarine-carried aircraft remained a curiosity, not a priority. History would remember the irony. The only air attack on the continental United States during World War II became a footnote rather than a turning point. It demonstrated reach without consequence, daring without leverage. A mission that crossed an ocean and rewrote the boundaries of possibility ultimately changed nothing about the war's direction. In the end, it revealed a hard truth of modern warfare. Distance can be conquered, but victory demands more than a rival. In the vast machinery of the Second World War, the mission of a single submarine and a single aircraft occupies an unusual place. It stands in stark contrast to the massed Allied bombing campaigns that would later define the air war. Thousands of aircraft, entire cities reduced to rubble, industrial capacity shattered through sustained pressure. The Japanese strike on the American mainland was never meant to compete with that scale. It was psychological warfare distilled to its purest form, reach without permanence, shock without follow-through. On both sides of the Pacific, ideas of psychological impact evolved differently. Allied planners increasingly relied on overwhelming force, believing morale would collapse under relentless destruction. Japan, constrained by resources and time, pursued singular, dramatic acts intended to unbalance a stronger enemy. The submarine-launched airstrike fit that logic perfectly, ingenious, daring, and ultimately insufficient against an industrial war. Yet the mission's legacy extended beyond its immediate failure. Technically, it proved something that naval theorists would not forget. A submerged vessel could carry and deploy air power across intercontinental distances. The concept would later re-emerge in different forms: submarine-launched ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and reconnaissance platforms that reshaped global strategy during the Cold War. What I-25 accomplished in 1942 foreshadowed a future in which the most powerful weapons in the world would remain hidden beneath the ocean's surface. The human legacy is quieter. The submarine's crew returned to a war that was turning against them. I-25 would later be sunk in 1943 near the New Hebrides by U.S. Navy destroyers, taking much of its crew with it. Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita survived the war, later becoming a rare symbol of reconciliation when he returned to Brookings, Oregon, decades later as an invited guest, his sword donated to the town as a gesture of peace. The aircraft itself vanished, leaving no wreckage, no preserved relic. There are no monuments along the Oregon coast marking where the bombs fell, no museums dedicated to the aircraft that emerged briefly from a submarine's hangar. The memory survives mostly in archives, official reports, and a handful of photographs, fragments of a mission that crossed an ocean and then slipped quietly out of public consciousness. World War II was a conflict of extremes. It produced both industrial-scale destruction and fragile, improvised brilliance. On a single deck, desperation and innovation often stood side by side, separated only by a thin layer of steel. In the end, the submarine returned to the depths where it belonged. The ocean closed above it, erasing its wake. What remained was a story almost forgotten, an audacious idea that surfaced once, proved its reach, and then disappeared beneath history's waves, never to be repeated.